Japan looks peaceful. Cherry blossoms, ancient temples, bullet trains, neon cities. But beneath that familiar image is one of the most extreme geographic environments on Earth. Japan sits where four major tectonic plates meet. It has 111 active volcanoes, more than 14,000 islands, mountains covering around 70% of its land, enormous snow walls, tropical coral reefs, deep ocean trenches, and cities built in places where nature seems to say, "Don't build here." And the strangest part? Almost all of these things are connected. So today, we're counting down 50 facts about Japan that sound completely impossible, but are real. Let's start with number 50. Japan isn't just sitting on one piece of Earth's crust. The Japanese archipelago lies across a complex region where four major tectonic plates meet: the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the Eurasian Plate, and the North American Plate. These enormous slabs of Earth's crust are constantly moving. Some collide, while others dive beneath neighboring plates. And that one fact explains a lot about Japan. The earthquakes, the volcanoes, the mountains, even the deep trenches surrounding the islands. Japan is basically sitting on one of the most complicated pieces of Earth's machinery, and those moving plates create another problem. Volcanoes. Japan's official volcanic catalog lists 111 active volcanoes. They're scattered across the country, from Hokkaido in the north to Kyushu and the islands farther south. Some are enormous mountains, others are hidden beneath the ocean, and some are close enough to populated areas that volcanic activity is simply part of everyday life. Japan doesn't just have volcanoes, it has an entire volcanic landscape. Mount Fuji may be one of the most recognizable mountains on Earth. Its perfectly symmetrical shape has become a symbol of Japan. But Fuji isn't just a mountain, it's a volcano. Rising 3,776 meters above sea level, Fuji has erupted repeatedly throughout its history. Its most recent confirmed eruption began in 1707. Today, it looks peaceful, almost impossibly perfect. But that perfect cone was built by fire. If you live in Japan, an earthquake isn't necessarily a once-in-a-lifetime event. The country and its surrounding waters experience earthquakes constantly, although most are far too small to feel. That's because several tectonic plates are interacting beneath and around the archipelago. Most tremors are harmless, but occasionally the same system releases an enormous amount of energy. And that's why Japan has spent decades designing buildings, warning systems, and emergency procedures around one simple assumption: the ground will move again. Now look in the opposite direction, not into the mountains, down into the ocean. Off Japan's eastern coast, the seafloor drops into the Japan Trench. At its deepest points, the trench reaches more than 8 kilometers below sea level. For comparison, Mount Everest is 8,849 meters high. So, you could take one of Earth's highest mountains and place it down there, and its summit would barely reach the surface. When most people picture Japan, they imagine four main islands: Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. But that's nowhere near the official count. Japan's Geospatial Information Authority counted 14,125 islands using its electronic national map and a defined counting method. And that's important. This doesn't mean Japan suddenly discovered thousands of new islands. It means modern mapping counted the country's small natural landforms much more precisely. Japan is far more fragmented than it looks on a normal map. Some Japanese islands are ancient, but one of them gave us a front row seat to an island being built. In 2013, an underwater eruption began near Nishinoshima, south of Tokyo. Lava emerged from the ocean, cooled into solid rock, and gradually expanded the island. The new volcanic land eventually connected with the original island, dramatically changing its shape. Think about that. You could watch a new piece of Japan being created in real time. Now, look at Japan from above. There's something you notice almost immediately: mountains. Around 70% of Japan's land area is mountainous. That leaves relatively little flat land for cities, agriculture, and infrastructure. Which is one reason Japanese cities can feel incredibly dense. People aren't spreading across endless plains. They're building wherever the landscape gives them room. In Japan, the mountains decide where civilization fits. And those mountains create another extreme: snow. In the Tateyama Mountains, winter snowfall can become so enormous that roads disappear completely. When the snow is cleared in spring, walls can rise around 20 meters high. That's roughly the height of a 6-story building, and people actually travel through them. A normal mountain road becomes a corridor surrounded by giant walls of snow. Japan can literally bury a road beneath a building-sized wall of snow. And then Japan does something that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy movie. It has monkeys that live in snowy mountains. Japanese macaques can survive in some of the coldest environments inhabited by any non-human primate. In Nagano, they're famous for another reason. During winter, they gather around natural hot springs. You can literally see snow-covered monkeys sitting in steaming water while snow falls around them. It looks like a luxury spa, except the guests are wild monkeys, and the spa is surrounded by snow. But Japan isn't all snow and mountains. Travel far enough south, and the landscape changes completely. Okinawa has warm subtropical waters, white sand beaches, tropical vegetation, and extensive coral reef ecosystems. In fact, Japan stretches across such a large north to south range that its landscapes can look like they belong to completely different countries. You can have snowy mountains in the north and tropical reefs in the south, and they're both Japan. So, why can Japan's southern islands support such warm water ecosystems? One important reason is the Kuroshio Current. This powerful ocean current carries warm water northward from the tropical Pacific along Japan's coast. It influences temperatures, weather, marine ecosystems, and fishing. And it creates a fascinating connection between Japan and the enormous Pacific Ocean surrounding it. Even the water around Japan's helping shape the country. Japan is an island country, but its coastline is much longer than you might imagine. Japan has roughly 35,000 kilometers of coastline, and that's because the country isn't shaped like a simple block of land. It has thousands of islands, deep bays, peninsulas, cliffs, beaches, and incredibly irregular coastlines. That creates thousands of places where people can live, fish, build ports, and unfortunately, thousands of places exposed to the ocean. In Japan, the coastline is almost everywhere. Japan may not look like a Himalayan country, but its mountains are surprisingly high. The country has 23 mountain peaks above 3,000 meters. Most are concentrated in the Japanese Alps, and because these mountains rise dramatically from relatively narrow valleys, they dominate huge sections of the landscape. Mount Fuji is the highest at 3,776 meters, but it isn't the only giant. Japan has an entire alpine world hidden behind its cities. Lake Biwa looks peaceful, but geologically, it's ancient. The lake has a history stretching back roughly 4 million years, making it one of the oldest freshwater lake systems on Earth. Over that enormous period of time, unique species evolved in and around the lake. Today, Lake Biwa is Japan's largest lake and an important source of fresh water. But when you're standing beside it, it's easy to forget what you're actually looking at. You're looking at a survivor from an ancient Japan. Now forget the cities for a moment. A huge part of Japan is forest. Around 2/3 of the country's land is covered by forests. Mountain slopes disappear beneath dense vegetation, and some remote areas feel almost completely disconnected from modern Japan. On islands like Yakushima, ancient cedar forests create landscapes filled with moss, mist, and enormous trees. These forests aren't just beautiful. They store water, stabilize mountain soils, and feed rivers. Behind Japan's megacities is a remarkably green country. Now let's go to Tokyo. The world's image of Japan's biggest city hides something important. Tokyo sits on the Kanto Plain, one of Japan's largest lowland regions, and that flatland helped make the enormous metropolitan area possible. But there's a catch. Much of this region is extremely low compared with the surrounding mountains. Rivers cross the plain, storms bring huge amounts of water, and parts of the city are vulnerable to flooding. Tokyo's geography is both the reason it could grow and one of the problems it has to manage. Now combine the last few facts. A gigantic city, limited flatland, and one of the most active earthquake regions on Earth. That's Tokyo. Millions of people live in an environment where major earthquakes are a real possibility, which is why earthquake resistance isn't an optional feature in Japan. Buildings, railways, bridges, and emergency systems are designed with seismic risk in mind. Tokyo didn't eliminate the earthquake problem. It learned how to build around it. Japan doesn't have unlimited flat land, so sometimes it creates more. Kansai International Airport was built on artificial islands in Osaka Bay. Engineers literally created land in the ocean and built an international airport on top of it. But there was a huge problem. The seabed beneath the artificial islands was soft. Under the weight of the enormous airport, the ground began to settle. So engineers had to design the entire project around that movement. Japan's geography created the problem. Japanese engineering decided to build anyway. But airports aren't the only thing Japan has built where they probably shouldn't exist. The Seikan Tunnel connects Japan's main island of Honshu with Hokkaido. Its total length is about 53.85 kilometers, and more than 23 kilometers of that tunnel runs beneath the seabed. A train can enter the ground on one island, travel underneath the sea, and emerge on another island. Think about that. You're literally taking a train beneath the ocean. Japan has another problem created by geography. Islands are separated by water, and sometimes building a tunnel isn't practical. So Japan built bridges. The Akashi Kaikyo Bridge connects Kobe with Awaji Island across the Akashi Strait. Its main suspension span stretches about 1,991 meters. That's almost 2 kilometers of open space between its towers. And this bridge has to withstand strong winds, heavy traffic, and earthquakes. In Japan, even the ocean becomes an engineering challenge. But Japan doesn't always build over the water. Sometimes it goes underneath it. The Tokyo Bay Aqua Line connects the Chiba and Kanagawa sides of Tokyo Bay. Part of the route runs through an underwater tunnel. Then the road suddenly emerges from the sea and becomes a bridge. And between the tunnel and the bridge is an artificial island called Umihotaru. So drivers can literally travel through a tunnel beneath Tokyo Bay, stop on an artificial island, and then continue across the ocean. Japan's volcanoes aren't always simple mountains with a crater at the top. Some are enormous volcanic calderas. These are giant depressions created when huge volcanic systems erupt and collapse. One of the most famous examples is Mount Aso in Kyushu. Its caldera stretches roughly 25 kilometers across. And here's the crazy part. People live inside it. Roads cross it. Forests cover it. Agriculture happens there. An entire landscape exists inside the remains of an enormous volcanic system. You can't stop an earthquake, but you can change what happens to a building when the ground moves. Modern Japanese buildings can use flexible structures, dampers, and base isolation systems to reduce the forces transferred from the ground into the building. Instead of pretending earthquakes won't happen, engineers assume they will. Then they design around that reality. The building doesn't have to stay perfectly still. It has to move without collapsing. In Japan, movement is part of the design. Volcanoes don't just create mountains, they can create lakes. Across Japan, ancient volcanic craters have filled with water, producing landscapes with intense blues and greens. In some places, volcanic minerals and gases change the chemistry of the water. The result can look almost artificial. Bright turquoise water, steaming volcanic slopes, bare rocks surrounding the lake. It looks like another planet, but it's completely real. And all that volcanic activity has another advantage. Hot springs. Japan has thousands of natural hot spring sources, known as onsen. Groundwater can travel deep underground, where it is heated by geothermal energy before returning toward the surface. Entire towns have grown around these springs. Some sit beneath snowy mountains. Others are surrounded by volcanic landscapes. And for centuries, people have turned this geological heat into part of everyday Japanese culture. The same earth that can erupt can also make a perfect bath. Japan's forests get even more impressive on Yakushima. The island is famous for its ancient Japanese cedar trees, known as yakusugi. Some are estimated to be thousands of years old. They grow in an incredibly wet mountain environment where moss covers almost everything and clouds constantly move through the forest. Walk beneath these trees, and modern Japan seems to disappear. No skyscrapers, no highways, just trees that were already growing before modern civilization looked anything like it does today. Some parts of Japan feel older than history. Japan's islands have created some unusual relationships between people and wildlife. On Miyajima, near Hiroshima, deer have become one of the island's most recognizable sights. They wander through streets, parks, and temple areas while tourists walk around them. And the combination is almost surreal. Ancient Japanese shrines, a giant torii gate, tourists everywhere, and wild deer casually walking through the middle of it. Sometimes the strangest thing about Japan isn't what's on the landscape. It's what's walking across it. Japan's winter isn't just cold. In some regions, it's extreme. Places along the Sea of Japan can receive enormous amounts of snow during winter. Cold air crosses the relatively warm Sea of Japan, picks up moisture, and then rises when it reaches the mountains. The result can be staggering snowfall. Roads disappear. Roofs have to handle enormous loads. Snowplows work constantly, and entire cities can look completely different depending on the season. Japan's mountains and ocean work together to create some brutal winters. And here's where Japan's geography becomes almost ridiculous. The country stretches thousands of kilometers from north to south, so one part can be buried under snow, while another is surrounded by warm subtropical water. Hokkaido can look like a frozen world, Okinawa can look like the tropics, and between them are huge mountains, dense forests, megacities, volcanoes, and countless islands. So when someone asks, what's the weather like in Japan? There isn't really one answer. Japan contains several completely different worlds inside one country. Japan looks relatively small on a map, but its geography stretches much farther than you might expect. The Japanese archipelago extends for more than 3,000 kilometers from northeast to southwest. That's why the climate can change dramatically from one end of the country to the other. In the north, winter can mean deep snow and sea ice. Farther south, you can find subtropical islands, coral reefs, and warm ocean waters. And all of this exists within one long chain of islands. Japan isn't just a country. It's a geographic gradient stretching across thousands of kilometers. Here's the problem Japan has been dealing with for centuries. There simply isn't much flat land. Mountains dominate around 73% of Japan's land area, and major flat plains occupy only a relatively small part of the country. So cities, roads, railways, and farms are often squeezed into narrow strips between mountains and the sea. This is one reason Japan can feel incredibly dense. People aren't necessarily living in an enormous amount of space. They're concentrated wherever geography allows them to build. Japan's mountains create another unusual feature. Its rivers tend to be relatively short and steep. Water can fall from high mountain ranges toward the sea over surprisingly short distances. That means rivers can become extremely powerful during heavy rain. And Japan gets plenty of rain. Typhoons and seasonal rainfall can dump huge amounts of water into mountain catchments, so the same mountains that make Japan beautiful can also make flooding and landslides a serious danger. In Japan, water doesn't always have far to travel before reaching the ocean. Japan's geography also puts it directly in the path of powerful tropical storms. Typhoons can bring extreme rainfall, destructive winds, storm surges, and flooding. And because Japan is mountainous, heavy rain can quickly turn into dangerous runoff. But there's another interesting consequence. These storms are part of the reason Japan has developed such sophisticated systems for weather forecasting, disaster warnings, and infrastructure protection. Japan doesn't just live with extreme weather, it constantly prepares for it. Now here's something that doesn't sound like Japan at all. In winter, sea ice drifts into the waters around northern Hokkaido. The phenomenon is called drift ice, or ryuhyo. The Sea of Okhotsk is one of the few places outside the Arctic where you can experience this kind of natural sea ice environment. In places like Shiretoko, the coastline can become surrounded by enormous fields of floating ice, and yet this is still Japan. A country famous for neon cities has an Arctic-looking coastline. And then Japan goes in the completely opposite direction. Far to the south of Tokyo lies the Ogasawara Islands. They're thousands of kilometers from mainland Japan and surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. Their isolation has produced ecosystems found nowhere else. Some species evolved independently on these islands over enormous periods of time. The result is a place that feels less like Tokyo's backyard and more like a remote Pacific world. Yet politically and geographically, it's still Japan. These remote islands aren't just interesting because they're far away. They also matter enormously because Japan is surrounded by ocean. Islands such as Minamitorishima and Okinotorishima sit far from the main Japanese islands. Their locations help establish Japan's maritime zones and contribute to an enormous exclusive economic zone. In fact, Japan's exclusive economic zone is vastly larger than its land area. So when you look at Japan on a map, you're seeing only a small part of the country. A huge part of Japan exists in the ocean around it. We've already talked about Japan's thousands of islands, but there's another way to understand just how fragmented the country is. Japan has more than 10,000 remote islands. Some have large communities, some have fewer than 100 residents, and some are completely uninhabited. For people living on these islands, geography isn't an abstract concept. It affects transportation, food deliveries, healthcare, education, and communication. For some Japanese communities, the mainland is literally across the sea. Japan's geography doesn't just challenge roads, it challenges railways too. Mountains cover most of the country. Islands are separated by narrow seas. Cities are incredibly dense. So Japanese railways have had to go through mountains, underneath cities, across bridges, and through long tunnels. And this is one reason Japan developed such an extraordinary railway network. The landscape didn't make transportation easy. It forced Japan to become exceptionally good at it. And sometimes, going around the mountains simply isn't an option. Japan has had to drill straight through them. The Kanetsu Tunnel runs for about 11 kilometers through the mountains of central Japan. At its deepest point, it passes around 1,100 meters below the mountain peak. Imagine being inside a train, more than a kilometer beneath the summit of a mountain. And the train isn't climbing it, it's going straight through it. Japan has built entire communities on land that was created by volcanoes. One of the clearest examples is around Mount Sakurajima in Kagoshima. This isn't an ancient volcano sitting quietly in an empty wilderness. It's an active volcano sitting right beside a major city. People live here. Roads run around it. Ferries pass directly beneath its slopes, and volcanic ash can occasionally fall over the surrounding area. Imagine waking up, looking outside, and seeing an active volcano dominating your city's skyline. Japan's geography gets even stranger around its largest cities. Parts of the Tokyo metropolitan region sit at extremely low elevations. Some areas are even below sea level. This creates a problem. Rivers flow through the region. Storms can push enormous amounts of water toward the coast. And when the land is low, gravity doesn't exactly help. That's why Japan has built enormous flood control infrastructure, including massive underground water storage systems. Sometimes, protecting a city means building another city underneath it. And that underground system deserves a closer look. Beneath the Kano region is one of the most spectacular flood control structures ever built. Its huge underground shafts are connected by enormous tunnels. The largest chamber contains massive concrete pillars supporting the ceiling. It looks less like infrastructure and more like an underground cathedral. But it has a very practical purpose. When extreme rainfall threatens the surrounding region, enormous volumes of water can be diverted underground and eventually released toward the Edo River. It was built to fight floods, but it looks like science fiction. Now let's go back above ground. Japan's geography helped create another obsession: speed. The Shinkansen changed high-speed rail forever. Since the first Tokaido Shinkansen began operating in 1964, Japan has built one of the world's most famous high-speed railway networks. Modern Shinkansen trains can travel at more than 300 kilometers per hour on certain services, and they're doing it through a country filled with mountains, cities, and earthquakes. That's the impressive part. It's not just speed, it's speed adapted to an incredibly difficult landscape. Now, go south. Kyushu is one of Japan's most volcanically active regions. Volcanoes, geothermal areas, and hot springs are woven into the landscape. Some mountains are dormant, others remain active, and beneath the surface, enormous geothermal systems continue to reshape the land. This is why places like Beppu, Aso, and Kagoshima are famous for hot springs and volcanic scenery. In Kyushu, volcanic geology isn't something hidden underground. It's part of everyday life. We've talked about mountains throughout this video, but one mountain towers above all of them: Mount Fuji. At 3,776 meters, it is Japan's highest point. And its shape is unusually recognizable because Fuji is an almost perfectly symmetrical stratovolcano. It rises dramatically from relatively low surrounding terrain. That's why it dominates photographs, paintings, and the skyline from enormous distances. Few mountains have become as closely associated with an entire country as Fuji. Here's something you might never notice on a normal map. Japan's coastline isn't simply long, it's incredibly complicated. Thousands of islands create countless bays, channels, peninsulas, and sheltered waters. The Seto Inland Sea alone contains hundreds of islands scattered between Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. And these waters have shaped Japanese history for centuries. Fishing villages, ports, trade routes, bridges, ferries. Entire communities developed around these fragmented coastlines. Japan's geography didn't just surround its people, it shaped how they lived. We've already descended into the Japan Trench, but there's something even more important to understand. The ocean surrounding Japan isn't simply deep. Its seafloor is one of the most geologically active environments on the planet. Deep trenches sit beside underwater mountains, subduction zones stretch beneath the ocean, earthquakes begin below the seafloor, and enormous amounts of energy are constantly moving through this hidden landscape. From the surface, everything looks peaceful. But underneath Japan, the ocean floor is constantly moving. And this may be the biggest lesson of all. Almost everything we've seen in this video comes from the same basic forces: the mountains, the volcanoes, the islands, the trenches, the earthquakes, even the hot springs. They're all connected to Japan's position along one of the most complicated tectonic regions on Earth. The same geological forces that created Japan are still operating today. That's why Japan can feel so beautiful and so dangerous at the same time. The landscape isn't finished. It's still being created. And finally, here's the fact that connects everything. Japan isn't simply a country that happens to have mountains, volcanoes, earthquakes, snow, tropical islands, and deep ocean trenches. Those things created the country. They determined where people could live, where cities could grow, where roads and railways could be built, where farms could exist. They influenced Japanese architecture, transportation, food, industry, and even the way people prepare for disasters. Japan's geography isn't just something you see when you look at a map. It's something the entire country has been forced to adapt to. And that's what makes Japan so fascinating. Because beneath the neon lights, bullet trains, and enormous cities, the Earth is still in control. Japan may be famous for its technology, its cities, and its culture. But look beneath all of that, and you'll find something much older. A country shaped by fire, water, mountains, and moving continents. And perhaps that's what makes Japan so fascinating. It isn't simply living on its geography, it's constantly adapting to it.